The moment I opened the envelope, I realized there was something about my marriage I did not know. After 42 years together, that is not a sentence any wife expects to say. My name is Linda Harper. I am 67 years old, and until that afternoon, I believed there were very few surprises left between my husband and me. Robert and I had built an ordinary life by most standards. We raised 2 children, paid off our mortgage, celebrated anniversaries, survived difficult seasons, and learned how to grow older together. Like many couples who have been married for decades, we had settled into comfortable routines. We knew each other's habits. We finished each other's stories. We could often predict what the other person was thinking before a single word was spoken. That was why the envelope bothered me so much. It appeared on a rainy Tuesday while I was cleaning out a filing cabinet in our home office. The cabinet had not been organized in years. Most of the folders contained old tax returns, insurance documents, and warranty papers for appliances we no longer owned. I was halfway through the bottom drawer when a plain manila envelope slid loose from behind a stack of folders. At first, I almost threw it into the pile marked shred. Then I noticed Robert's handwriting on the front. The date written in the corner caught my attention immediately. It was nearly 8 years old. Curious, I opened it. Inside were several payroll statements from Robert's former employer. I frowned. We had both retired several years earlier, and I could not imagine why he would save something like that. Then I looked closer. The numbers did not make sense. Each statement showed a year-end bonus that was significantly larger than what I remembered discussing at the time. I checked another statement. Then another. The pattern continued. I sat down slowly in the desk chair. My husband had received annual bonuses far larger than I ever knew about. Thousands of dollars more. Not once. Not twice. Year after year. At first, I assumed there had to be an explanation. Perhaps these were preliminary figures. Perhaps I was misunderstanding something. Robert had always handled most of the paperwork related to his retirement benefits. But as I continued reading, the details became impossible to ignore. The bonus amounts were clearly listed. The payments had been deposited. The money had existed. Yet somehow, I had never known about it. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the windows. The sound filled the silence as I stared at the documents spread across the desk. My thoughts moved quickly from confusion to concern. Why would Robert hide something like this? We had never kept separate finances. We discussed major purchases together. We planned for retirement together. We trusted each other. At least, I thought we did. I carefully returned the papers to the envelope and placed it on the desk. For several minutes, I simply sat there staring at it. The envelope seemed strangely small for something capable of changing the way I viewed 42 years of marriage. And the longer I looked at it, the more one question refused to leave my mind. If Robert hid the bonuses, what else had he been keeping from me all these years? For the rest of that afternoon, I tried to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation. 42 years of marriage does not disappear because of one envelope. At least that was what I kept repeating in my head. Still, the documents remained exactly where I left them on the desk, and every time I walked past the home office, I felt their presence. When Robert came home from meeting a former coworker for coffee, everything seemed normal. He kissed me on the cheek, asked what I wanted for dinner, and complained about the rainy weather. The familiar routine should have reassured me. Instead, I found myself studying him more closely than I had in years. Had there been signs I missed? Moments that should have raised questions? That evening, after we finished dinner, Robert settled into his favorite recliner to watch a baseball game. I sat on the opposite side of the living room pretending to read a magazine. In reality, I spent most of the evening watching him. He laughed at the announcers. He made comments about the players. He looked exactly like the man I had shared my life with for decades. Yet somehow, the envelope had created a distance between us that had not existed the day before. Over the next several days, I said nothing. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately. Another part wanted answers first. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that asking questions before understanding the situation might only create confusion. So I waited. While doing so, I began noticing small details from the past that suddenly seemed different. There had been years when Robert insisted we postpone certain vacations even though I believed we could afford them. There were times he quietly declined expensive purchases without offering much explanation. Once, nearly 10 years earlier, he sold a classic truck he loved and never fully explained why. At the time, none of those decisions seemed unusual. Now they returned to my memory carrying new significance. One afternoon, I pulled several old financial folders from a closet shelf. I was not looking for evidence of wrongdoing. I was looking for context. As I sorted through retirement statements, tax records, and bank summaries, I noticed something else. Whenever the larger bonuses appeared in Robert's payroll records, there seemed to be corresponding withdrawals from accounts within a few months afterward. The money did not appear to stay there. It moved somewhere. The discovery only deepened the mystery. If Robert had hidden the bonuses to spend money recklessly, I would have expected signs of it. There were none. We lived comfortably, but modestly. No secret luxury purchases. No unexplained trips. No lavish hobbies. The money had gone somewhere, but I could not see where. That realization unsettled me more than the envelope itself. A secret with no obvious purpose is far more difficult to understand than one with a clear motive. Late one evening, after Robert had gone to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea and stared out the dark window above the sink. Rain had finally stopped. The neighborhood was quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked briefly before silence returned. I thought about trust. I thought about marriage. And I thought about how one unexpected discovery could make the past look completely different. Because the more I examined our history, the more certain I became that the envelope was only the beginning of a much larger story. The following week, I became something I never expected to be after 4 decades of marriage. I became an investigator in my own life. Not because I wanted to catch Robert doing something wrong. In fact, I hoped every day that I would discover a simple explanation and laugh at my own imagination. But the questions refused to disappear. Every answer seemed to create 2 new mysteries. One morning, while organizing additional financial records, I noticed something unusual buried in several years of tax documents. A series of transfers appeared repeatedly around the same time each year. The amounts varied, but the timing matched the bonus payments almost perfectly. The money always moved within weeks of being deposited. I stared at the figures for several minutes. The transfers did not go into any account I recognized. They simply disappeared behind a string of account numbers that meant nothing to me. For the first time, I considered confronting Robert directly. The thought stayed with me throughout the day, yet something held me back. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps it was the feeling that I was still missing a crucial piece of information. Whatever the reason, I continued looking. Later that afternoon, I drove to the public library to return several books. While walking through the parking lot, a memory surfaced unexpectedly. Nearly 12 years earlier, Robert had insisted on taking a weekend trip alone. At the time, he explained that an old friend needed help with a personal matter. The explanation seemed reasonable, and I never questioned it. Now, for reasons I could not explain, the memory felt important. Over the next few days, more forgotten moments returned. There were occasional phone calls Robert took privately, several unexplained day trips, a handful of weekends when he seemed unusually distracted. None of it had seemed suspicious at the time because trust has a way of filling in the gaps where information is missing. But now those gaps appeared larger than before. Then something happened that changed everything. While searching through an old file box stored in the garage, I found a folder filled with documents related to our retirement planning. Most of the paperwork was familiar. Then a single page slipped free and landed on the floor. I picked it up and froze. It was a statement connected to the same unknown account number I had seen in the transfers. My pulse quickened. For the first time, I had something concrete. The statement was nearly 7 years old. The balance was substantial, far larger than I expected. Yet what caught my attention most was not the amount of money. It was a name printed beneath the account information. I read it twice to make sure I had not misunderstood. The name did not belong to Robert. It did not belong to me. It did not belong to either of our children. I sat down on a storage box in the garage and stared at the page. Suddenly, every theory I had developed over the past week felt less certain. If the account belonged to someone else, then the story was far more complicated than hidden bonuses. And as I looked at that unfamiliar name, one realization settled heavily in my mind. I was no longer searching for missing money. I was searching for a person I had never heard of before. For the next 2 days, I carried the folded statement with me like a secret I could not put down. I slipped it into a notebook and reread it whenever I found a quiet moment. The unfamiliar name stared back at me every time. Daniel Mercer. I had never heard Robert mention anyone by that name. Not once in 42 years. Yet there it was attached to an account that had received money connected to the bonuses he never told me about. The mystery that began with hidden income had become something else entirely. On Thursday morning, while Robert was out playing golf with friends, I sat at the kitchen table reviewing everything I had discovered. The payroll records, the transfers, the account statement, the dates. I wrote notes on a yellow legal pad and drew lines connecting pieces of information. The pattern became clearer, but no less confusing. The money had moved consistently for years. Whatever Robert was doing, it was not impulsive. It was planned, intentional, long-term. That realization unsettled me. Secrets that last for months are one thing. Secrets maintained for years require commitment. Later that afternoon, I found myself looking through old photo albums stored in a hallway closet. At first, I was simply searching for distractions. Then something unexpected caught my attention. In an album from nearly 15 years earlier, there was a photograph from a company picnic Robert attended. I studied the image carefully. Dozens of employees stood together smiling for the camera. On the back of the photograph, several names had been written in blue ink. As my eyes moved down the list, I froze. There it was, Daniel Mercer. My heart immediately began racing. At least now I knew the name belonged to someone Robert had known through work. But that discovery only created more questions. Why would Robert secretly transfer money to a former coworker? Why hide it from me? Why continue doing it for so many years? That evening, Robert sat across from me during dinner discussing ordinary things. A neighbor's new fence, an upcoming family birthday party, the weather forecast. I answered politely, but my thoughts remained elsewhere. More than once, I nearly brought up the account. More than once, I stopped myself. Something told me the story was still incomplete. The next morning, another piece appeared unexpectedly. While organizing additional papers in the garage, I found an old retirement planning binder. Tucked inside was a handwritten note in Robert's handwriting. Most of it contained ordinary reminders, but one sentence stood out immediately. It simply read, "Do not forget the promise." No explanation followed. No details. Just those 4 words. I stared at them for a long time. A promise. Suddenly, the mystery shifted again. Maybe this was not about hidden spending. Maybe it was not about betrayal at all. Maybe it was about an obligation, a commitment, a responsibility Robert felt he could never abandon. But if that was true, why keep it from me? As I closed the binder and looked out across the quiet garage, I realized I had reached a crossroads. The evidence no longer pointed toward the conclusion I originally feared. Yet I was still missing the one piece that mattered most. I knew there was a secret account. I knew there was a man named Daniel Mercer. And now I knew there had been a promise. What I did not know was how those 3 things were connected. By the beginning of the following week, I had reached a conclusion that surprised me. I no longer believed Robert's secret involved selfishness. If anything, every clue pointed in the opposite direction. The money had not been spent on luxury. It had not disappeared into reckless decisions. It had been transferred with remarkable consistency year after year. Whatever purpose it served, Robert considered it important enough to protect and important enough to continue. The problem was that I still had no idea why. On Tuesday morning, I decided to take a different approach. Instead of searching through financial records, I began searching through memories. Sometimes people leave clues in conversations long before they leave them in documents. I thought about the years when Robert worked at the manufacturing company. He often spoke fondly of certain coworkers. He attended retirement parties, company picnics, and holiday gatherings. Yet I could not remember him ever mentioning Daniel Mercer. That absence felt strange. If Daniel was important enough to receive years of financial support, why had his name never surfaced in ordinary conversation? Later that afternoon, I visited an old friend named Carol whose husband had worked with Robert for nearly 2 decades. We met for coffee at a small cafe near the town square. I kept my questions casual. We talked about retirement, grandchildren, and old neighborhood stories. Eventually, I asked whether she remembered anyone named Daniel Mercer. Carol immediately nodded. "Of course," she said. "Daniel worked with our husbands for years." My heart skipped slightly. What was he like? Carol grew quiet for a moment. "A good man. Very hardworking." Then her expression changed. "His family went through some difficult times." Before I could ask more, she glanced toward the window. "I do not know all the details. Robert might know more than I do." The answer was frustrating, but it confirmed something important. Daniel was real. He was not an accounting error or a forgotten business contact. He had been part of Robert's life. On the drive home, my thoughts raced. That evening, while putting away groceries, I noticed Robert standing in the backyard looking toward the setting sun. For a brief moment, I simply watched him through the kitchen window. He looked older than he once had. The lines on his face were deeper. His hair was thinner, yet there was also something familiar in the way he stood quietly with his hands in his pockets. This was the man who had spent 42 years beside me. The man who had helped raise our children. The man who never forgot birthdays and always made coffee before I woke up. The man who was somehow connected to a mystery I could not untangle. As darkness settled outside, I returned to the home office and reviewed everything again. Payroll statements, account transfers, the unknown account, Daniel Mercer, the promise. None of it fit together completely. Then I noticed something I had overlooked before. One transfer record contained a reference number connected to a document that was not in the folder. The missing document appeared to be filed elsewhere. For the first time in days, I felt a surge of anticipation. Somewhere in this house was a piece of information I had not yet seen. And deep down, I sensed it might finally explain why Robert had carried this secret for so many years. The next afternoon, I found the missing document in the last place I expected. It was tucked inside an old retirement planning binder stored on the highest shelf in our bedroom closet. At first glance, it looked insignificant. Just another piece of paperwork among dozens of others. But the reference number matched the one I had been searching for. My hands trembled slightly as I sat down on the edge of the bed and opened it. What I found was not a bank statement. It was a letter. The paper had yellowed with age, and the date at the top showed it had been written nearly 13 years earlier. The letter was addressed to Robert. As I began reading, I immediately recognized the signature at the bottom. Daniel Mercer. I read every line twice, then a third time. By the time I finished, the room felt completely silent. The letter explained that Daniel had become seriously ill and could no longer work consistently. Medical expenses had created overwhelming financial pressure on his family. He thanked Robert for his friendship and support during a difficult period. But it was one paragraph in particular that captured my attention. Daniel wrote that he was worried most about his daughter. She had just started college, and he feared he would not be able to help her continue her education. I stared at those words for a long time. Suddenly, the mystery shifted once again. This was not a business arrangement. It was personal, deeply personal. Yet even now, I still did not understand why Robert would hide it from me. Later that evening, while Robert watched television in the living room, I returned to the letter. This time I noticed something I had missed before. Folded behind the final page was a newspaper clipping. The article featured a young woman receiving a college scholarship award. Her name was listed beneath the photograph. Emily Mercer. My heart skipped. Mercer. The same last name. The realization hit me immediately. Daniel's daughter. I sat frozen for several seconds. Then I continued reading. According to the article, Emily had graduated near the top of her class despite significant family hardships. The story described her determination, academic achievements, and plans for the future. There was no mention of Robert, no mention of financial support, no indication that anyone outside her family knew the full story. I carefully set the clipping beside the letter. Suddenly, the pieces were beginning to connect. The hidden bonuses, the transfers, the unknown account, Daniel Mercer, his daughter. Yet one enormous question remained unanswered. How much had Robert actually done? And why had he never told me? The following morning, after Robert left to meet friends for breakfast, I searched through additional folders connected to the account. That was when I discovered a series of tuition payment records spanning several years. The amounts matched the bonus transfers almost exactly. My breath caught in my throat. The money had not disappeared into a secret life. It had helped someone. For years. Quietly. Consistently. Without recognition. Without acknowledgement. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the documents spread across the table. The story I had imagined was falling apart. In its place, a different story was emerging. One that seemed far more complicated than betrayal. Yet even as my suspicions faded, one final mystery remained. Why had Robert chosen to carry this burden alone instead of sharing it with the person who had stood beside him for more than 4 decades? That evening, I finally decided I could not carry the questions any longer. After dinner, Robert and I sat together on the back porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The air was cool, and the first hints of winter lingered in the breeze. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then I looked at him and said the words I had been rehearsing for days. "Who is Daniel Mercer?" Robert froze. Not dramatically, not guiltily, just completely still. The expression on his face told me everything before he said a single word. He knew exactly what I had discovered. He lowered his eyes and stared at his hands. "How much do you know?" he asked quietly. "Enough to know there is a story I was never told." The silence that followed felt long and heavy. Finally, he nodded. "You deserve the truth." He leaned back in his chair and looked out across the darkening yard. "Daniel and I worked together for nearly 20 years. We started at the company around the same time. We raised our families during the same years. We sat next to each other through countless meetings. He was more than a coworker. He was my closest friend." I listened carefully as he continued. Years earlier, Daniel's health had begun to decline. Medical bills piled up. His ability to work became unpredictable. The stress placed enormous pressure on his family. "He never asked me for money," Robert said. "Not once." Instead, Daniel worried constantly about his daughter. He wanted her to attend college. He wanted her to have opportunities he never had. But every year the situation became more difficult. Robert paused before continuing. One afternoon, after a doctor's appointment, Daniel told me he was afraid he would not be able to keep that promise to her. I could hear the emotion in his voice. A few months later, he passed away. My heart sank. Suddenly, the newspaper clipping and the letters made sense in a way they never had before. Robert took a deep breath. "A few weeks before he died, I promised him something." He looked directly at me. "I promised I would help his daughter finish school if she ever needed it." The words settled between us. Everything became quiet. "You used the bonuses?" I said softly. He nodded. "Every year." I stared at him. "For all those years?" "Yes." Then he said something that surprised me even more. "The first payment was supposed to be temporary, but life kept presenting new challenges. Tuition, housing, books, then graduate school. Every year I thought it might be the last." I remained silent. The mystery that had haunted me for weeks was finally unraveling. Yet one question still remained. "Why did you never tell me?" Robert looked away toward the fading light on the horizon. "Because the promise was between two friends, and because I never wanted recognition for keeping it." I sat quietly for several moments after Robert finished speaking. The anger and suspicion that had followed me for days seemed to dissolve all at once. In their place came something unexpected. Sadness. Not because of what he had done, but because of everything he had carried alone. The cool evening air drifted across the porch as darkness settled around us. Neither of us spoke immediately. Some stories need time to settle before they can be understood. Finally, I looked at him. "She finished school?" Robert smiled softly. "Yes." There was pride in his voice. "She graduated with honors." He paused. "Then she earned a graduate degree a few years later." I thought about the newspaper clipping I had found. The young woman smiling beside her scholarship award. At the time, she had simply been a stranger connected to a mystery. Now she felt connected to our lives in a way I never could have imagined. "Does she know?" I asked. Robert nodded. "Eventually she figured it out." A small laugh escaped him. "She was smarter than I expected." For the first time in weeks, I smiled too. Then his expression grew more serious. "Linda, there is something else you should know." I waited. The account was never entirely mine. I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He looked down at his hands before answering. "Some of the money came from the bonuses, but not all of it." My heart tightened. "What are you saying?" He met my eyes. "Several times over the years, I added money from my personal spending budget. I sold things I did not really need. I skipped purchases I wanted." Suddenly, memories flooded back. The classic truck he sold, vacations he postponed, hobbies he quietly gave up. All those moments I had revisited with suspicion now carried a completely different meaning. Robert smiled sadly. "Every time I thought about spending money on myself, I remembered Daniel sitting in that hospital room worrying about his daughter." I looked away toward the darkness beyond the porch. The mystery that once felt threatening now felt heartbreaking. Not because Robert had hidden money, because he had hidden sacrifice. "Why keep it from me?" I asked again, more gently this time. He hesitated. "Because I was afraid you would insist on helping." I stared at him. "And that would have been a problem?" His smile widened slightly. "You have always had a bigger heart than I do." I laughed softly despite myself. "That is not true." "It is." For a moment, we sat together in comfortable silence. Then Robert stood and disappeared into the house. When he returned a few minutes later, he carried a small folder. He handed it to me. Inside were photographs, graduation pictures, letters, holiday cards, thank you notes, updates spanning years, a life unfolding one milestone at a time. At the very top sat a recent photograph of a smiling woman standing beside two young children. Written on the back was a simple message. Thank you for helping my father keep his promise to me. As I read those words, my eyes filled with tears. The hidden bonuses had never been about money. They had been about loyalty, friendship, responsibility, and a promise that survived long after the person who inspired it was gone. The following Sunday, Robert and I took a drive through the countryside just as we had done countless times throughout our marriage. The trees had surrendered most of their leaves, and the fields stretched quietly beneath a pale winter sky. As we drove, neither of us felt the need to fill every moment with conversation. Some understandings arrive without many words. During the weeks that followed, I found myself looking at our life through a different lens. The envelope that once felt like evidence of deception had become the doorway to a story I never expected to discover. I thought about all the years I had assumed I knew everything important about the man sitting beside me. Then I realized something simple. Knowing someone completely is impossible. Even after decades together, there are still corners of the heart that remain private, not because of dishonesty, but because people carry certain responsibilities quietly. One afternoon, a letter arrived in our mailbox. The return address immediately caught Robert's attention. Without saying a word, he handed it to me. Inside was a holiday card from Emily Mercer and her family. The photograph showed smiling children standing beside a decorated Christmas tree. A handwritten note filled the inside. She wrote about her career, her family, and the opportunities that had shaped her life. Near the end of the message, she included a sentence that stayed with me long after I finished reading. She wrote that one act of kindness had changed the future of generations she would never even meet. I handed the card back to Robert and watched his expression soften. There was no pride in his face, no desire for recognition, only quiet gratitude that a promise had been kept. That evening, as we sat together in the living room, I asked him whether he would make the same decision again if given the choice. He smiled immediately. Without hesitation, I nodded. So would I. He looked surprised, even knowing how much confusion it caused. I laughed softly. Maybe next time you could tell your wife first. He laughed too. Then the room grew comfortably quiet. I reached for his hand and thought about how close I had come to misunderstanding everything. The hidden bonuses had never been about secrecy for its own sake. They were about loyalty to a friend, compassion for a family, faithfulness to a promise. Most of all, they were a reminder that character reveals itself not through grand speeches, but through small choices repeated year after year. As snow began falling gently outside our window, I realized the greatest discovery was not the truth behind the money. It was the realization that after 42 years of marriage, I had learned something new about the man I loved. And what I learned made me respect him more than ever before.